Conventional wisdom says if you can afford to buy a home, you should. Renting, so it's said, simply pays someone else's mortgage, leaving you with nothing to show for years of payments. Alex Avery questions that wisdom in his new book. It's called The Wealthy Renter: How to Choose Housing That Will Make You Rich. He's a real estate analyst at CIBC World Markets, and Alex Avery joins us now for more. You are really spitting into the wind with this one, aren't you? So, we're going to get into this. You describe people who advocate home ownership as part of a cult. How so?
Well, homeownership is very, very heavily promoted by all sorts of people, your parents, your friends, your family, real estate agents, lenders, even the government gets into the promotion of homeownership. And it's quite amazing when you actually look into all of the details of how this conventional wisdom comes about. It's actually a well-orchestrated promotional campaign to get Canadians to buy homes.
But maybe all of those people think it's a great idea to buy homes because it's a great idea to buy homes. You don't agree?
I think everyone's unique. I think of housing as a lot like prescription drugs, where it's unique to the individual, and even for that individual at different points in your life, you may have different needs. And I think that if you have a public dialogue that has only one answer for everyone, that's a big problem. So I wrote The Wealthy Barber or The Wealthy Renter to counter that, to tell the other side of the housing story.
You definitely wanted to play off The Wealthy Barber, didn't you?
I did talk to David Chilton.
Yes, that's where the title comes from. Okay, so if renting is such a great idea, you of course then rent, right?
No, that's not the case. I'm a homeowner.
You are a homeowner despite everything.
I am, and I think, like I said, for everyone, the answer is different, and it depends on your circumstances. And I think, in fact, while it might on the surface appear that me not being a renter might undermine the credibility of my argument, I think it, in fact, makes it that much more powerful in the sense that I'm not a renter, I'm a homeowner, and I'm still advocating that I think renting makes a lot of sense, and that it's maligned.
Why don't you rent?
We bought a house a number of years ago. We had children, and we were in a financial position where we could afford to buy a home, and so we did.
Is it not the case, as we suggested in the intro, that paying rent is basically paying someone else's mortgage and investing in somebody else's equity as opposed to your own? Is that not the case?
It's a misconception. You certainly are paying rent for the right to occupy a space for a given period of time, but it's also a misconception that owners are not paying rent, in the sense that if you borrow a mortgage to buy a house, you're paying rent to the bank in the form of interest. Mm-hmm. And then ultimately, to the extent that you end up owning your house without a mortgage, you're paying rent to yourself and you're consuming it, because you could take the money that you have tied up in the house and invest it in something else, and that could generate an income that you could live off of.
Okay, but the follow-up is, if you're paying a mortgage, admittedly with some rent, to a bank, you at least have some equity at the end of the day. You have something to show for it. If you're renting, you're basically handing that check over to somebody else, and at the end of your renting days, you have nothing to show for it. So,
that's true.
So why is that a smarter way to go?
Well, it's not an unqualified smarter way to go. I would say there's always qualifications, and the one with housing is that along with buying a house, you get a mortgage, and a mortgage is a forced savings program. You can't have no financial discipline and simply rely on a mortgage, because even with a mortgage, you may never accumulate any financial wealth. But you can replicate a forced savings program in a lot of different ways, and homeownership just happens to be one of them. And given that it's just a way to finance an investment, you can do it with a house, or you can do it with other things. And in the book, I point out that house prices are higher than they've ever been in Canada. Canadians are borrowing more money today to buy their first home than they ever have in the past.
Because it's seen as a safe investment.
And it's heavily promoted.
Okay, but is it still? I mean, it is a safe investment, isn't it?
It depends on the market, and there are a lot of qualifications there. I would say that house prices being higher than they ever have been, and more debt for Canadians than we've ever had. I think most of the public figures in Canada have come out and said that they're concerned about the housing market. I think there's good reason to be concerned.
In Toronto, is it a good investment?
Well, in the book, I go through each of the different markets. I talk about Vancouver, I talk about Toronto, Calgary, Edmonton, Ottawa, and Montreal. And what you can say is that if you look at Vancouver, you look at Toronto, and you look at Montreal, all three of those markets have the characteristics in place to be expensive housing markets. So just because house prices are high doesn't mean that they're going to come down, but it also doesn't guarantee that they won't.
Well, let's take a look at this curve here. I mean, the curve is, Sheldon, you want to put this up? Toronto real estate prices, the annual average of residential sales, and if you own a home, that is certainly the direction you want to see that curve going in. Not if you want to get into the market, but certainly if you own a home. So if we are going to be having probably 3.5 million people moving into the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area over the next 20 years, does that chart and the direction that curve is going in, up and up and up and up, suggest that if you can afford it, buying a house is still a great investment?
I don't think it's that simple. I think there are all sorts of factors that go into that curve that you've seen. For instance, the Greenbelt, introduced in 2004, has a very material impact on house prices. Government policy in general has a very, very significant impact on house prices. And to the extent that you're hearing from government sources today that they're considering taking action to change policies around housing, I don't think that you can rely on that trend continuing. And when you look at things like the Greenbelt, it was brought in for a number of reasons, and I don't think it's going away. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't see other policies change that could significantly impact house prices.
Let me just make sure I understand this, because the Greenbelt obviously was brought in, that chunk of land north of the city, north of the capital city, where no housing development on that land. We're going to protect it for farmland and other purposes, but not housing developments. And in your view, did that create a sort of an artificial scarcity of property and therefore send housing prices higher than they might otherwise have been?
I would say it absolutely had that effect.
Absolutely had that effect.
A lot of land that was available for development, and then one day it wasn't available. It had the effect of making Toronto into almost an island.
So if we intensify housing development in the city below the Greenbelt, shouldn't that countermand the effects of the Greenbelt?
It should, but I think you're also going to have to see Canadians adapting to different forms of housing. I mean, people complain about all of the condos that are going up, saying, who wants to live in a 500 square foot box in the sky? And the answer, unfortunately, is that people who can't afford a 2,000 square foot house on the ground.
So who should rent?
There are different circumstances for everyone.
Okay, but not you, right? Like, you're married, a couple kids, you can't afford a house, so it makes no sense for you to rent, right?
I don't think that's necessarily the case.
No?
We happen to own a house right now, and if I had to make the choice today, I would choose to be a renter. I'm in a house. It's quite expensive to transact. That's one of the big drawbacks of home ownership, is that the transaction costs are very, very high. And I think today I'd be hard pressed to find a lot of people where it makes sense to buy homes.
Millennials who are able to buy a home, should they?
Depends on whether or not they want to have the labor mobility to pursue jobs in other markets. They may have a situation where they're a single. You wouldn't want to buy a house without understanding how your life is likely to evolve over the next 5 and 10 years. Again, transacting on housing is very, very expensive. And the flexibility of renting is fabulous. I mean, today, one of the things that I think is of concern is the elevated level of pricing. Home prices relative to incomes are higher than they've ever been. I think one of the great things about renting today is that you're not taking any house price risk.
I know we talked earlier about some of the mythology around all of this, but it seems to me that part of that mythology involves the notion that once you buy a house, you have somehow entered adulthood. I mean, it's the real deal once you're a homeowner. Would you admit that that's the case?
There's a lot of human elements to housing, and certainly pride of ownership is one of those big things. And I think governments are very, very keen on promoting home ownership because people actually behave differently once they become homeowners.
How so?
They tend to go to work on a more regular basis. They work harder because they've got a big mortgage to pay. They're more respectful of property because they've got something and they don't want people messing with their thing, so they don't mess with other people's things. It's actually quite good for society, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone should buy a home. And I don't think that today is actually a fabulous time to be buying a home in Canada's expensive housing markets.
Because?
Because house prices are stretched, interest rates are lower than they've ever been, debt is higher than it's ever been. And I think if you're one of those people who can barely afford to get into the housing market, I think you're taking a big risk.
But as you described the circumstances that have resulted in those conditions existing, there's no reason to assume that over the next 20, well, let's not say 20, let's say 5 or 10 years, that those conditions won't persist. So if you can get in, why wouldn't you get in?
Why would you put all of your eggs in one basket? If you look at all of the investment advice that is out there, probably the most popular amongst the financial advisory world would be that you want to diversify. I mean, if I was to say to you, well, I think this stock is going to go up, I want you to borrow 20 times your net worth, you'll pay it off over the next 25 years, let's hope it goes up.
Okay, let's play this game here. Okay, we'll play it out. Buying a stock and buying a house are not the same thing.
True.
Buying a house has got emotional connection to it. It's where you're going to maybe raise kids. It's where you're going to spend, well, you might get rid of a stock after a year or 2 or 5. You may live in a house for 20 years or 50. So can you make that comparison? Does that analogy work?
Well, I think where it becomes problematic is if you have that as your sole investment. If you're counting on buying a home being your financial safety net for the future, I think that's a little bit too high of a risk to take. If you look at all of the characteristics of housing as an investment, it's actually a very poor investment. The transaction costs are very, very high. The liquidity is very, very low. It takes a long time to close. What if your kid is having trouble in school and you don't want to move schools? What if you have to move for a job? I mean, there's all sorts of reasons that you might not want to have all of your eggs in one basket tied up in housing, particularly entering a market on a highly levered basis at a high point in pricing.
That is, I mean, I can't dispute anything that you're saying, but the somehow emotional mythology and poetry around home ownership, I mean, you're kind of, as I said off the top, you're kind of spitting in the face of hundreds of years of, our understanding of the way things ought to be.
Well, I wouldn't say hundreds of years. I would say that the mythology around housing has been around a long time, but it's evolved over time. And I think one of the most dangerous things about housing is that mythology, in the sense that the housing cycle is a long cycle. And it's long enough that by the time house prices are hitting all-time highs and people are very, very enthusiastic, and consensus says that, if you can, you should buy. It's right at that point when the housing market turns. And when it does, like it did in the US in 2006, the results can be devastating.
Should there be incentives in place, as there are for home ownership, for renters?
I would say if you wanted to balance the market, absolutely. I mean, you look at the government of Canada, we've got CMHC, which lowers the interest rate for home buyers. You pay no taxes on capital gains when you sell your house. You can borrow money out of your RRSP to buy a house, and only to buy a house. There are no other exceptions. You can get your land transfer tax reimbursed when you buy as a first-time home buyer. There are none of those advantages to renting.
And you think there should be?
I'm not sure whether necessarily you need to promote renting as much as maybe you should dial it back on promoting home ownership.
Okay. The scenario you put forward a minute ago, where in the United States the market went ridiculous and thousands of people had homes underwater. That happened in the States because of a pretty specific set of circumstances that reared their heads, all of them at the same time. You haven't, in your analysis, seen anything like that potentially happening in Canada, have you?
No. I think we were much more responsible lenders in terms of the banks. I think that the housing policy has been a lot more responsible as well. CMHC has dialed back a number of the policies that they had loosened in the run-up to the U.S. housing crisis.
No one's buying houses here for no money down.
That's a tough statement to make or to support. It's on the surface, perhaps, but I'm not sure that there aren't people that are borrowing the remainder of the required down payment. It's it's very difficult to tell, and it doesn't necessarily need to be a housing crisis in the style of the U.S. housing downturn for it to be a devastatingly poor financial investment for an individual. If you're buying a house and you're stretching so far that you're going to live the next 25 years house poor, and it turns out that house prices don't go up, then I think that's a pretty devastating impact on your lifestyle.
So at the end of the day, don't discount renting. That's what you're saying.
Exactly.
Gotcha. Alex Avery, The Wealthy Renter is the name of the book, How to Choose Housing That Will Make You Rich. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Steve.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.